There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that lives inside those who understand too much. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It doesn't erupt, or demand, or break. It simply settles softly into the spaces behind the eyes, the pauses in the voice, the moments when they say, "It's okay. I get it," even when something inside them quietly sinks. People who always understand become the emotional safe haven for others, the interpreter of moods, the absorber of disappointments, the one who smooths the world so others don't trip on its roughness. But rarely does anyone ask what it costs them. Rarely does anyone wonder how much they hide behind that calm. This is the story of that hidden weight, the subtle loneliness of those who understand everyone except themselves. The burden of softness. There is a particular silence carried by those who are always expected to understand. It isn't loud. It doesn't remind anyone of its presence. It lives quietly, like a mist around the heart, soft, almost invisible, yet always there. For people who learn to be gentle, the world often responds with relief. They become the friend who listens without interrupting, the partner who forgives before the apology is fully spoken, the sibling who adjusts their tone so no one feels uncomfortable. Their empathy becomes the cushion that protects everyone else from sharp edges. But every cushion, eventually, becomes worn. This chapter explores that early, subtle burden, the moment someone becomes the calm one, not because they feel calm, but because others lean on the softness they offer. Sometimes it begins with a single moment, a raised voice they learned to avoid, a parent they didn't want to disappoint, a friend who needed more than they did. Other times, it's gradual, a lifetime of being praised for being mature, patient, understanding. Words that sound like compliments, yet quietly push them away from their own needs. Over time, they become fluent in reading emotional weather. They sense tension before it forms, so they soften their words. They feel someone's disappointment, so they reshape themselves. They understand too quickly, too deeply, too instinctively. And because they always manage, no one thinks to ask what it costs. Inside them grows a gentle ache, the ache of being the one who absorbs more than they release. The ache of knowing others rely on their softness, even on days when that softness feels paper thin. This chapter sets the stage for that hidden weight, the weight of carrying everyone's emotions while quietly tucking their own into the smallest, quietest corners. Where it all begins, the role of the understanding one rarely appears out of nowhere. It is shaped long before adulthood, in rooms where emotions felt unbalanced, in families where someone had to stay steady, or in childhood moments where softness became a form of survival. Many people trace this pattern back to their earliest relationships. Perhaps they grew up around unpredictable moods, where being attentive meant being safe. They learned to listen before speaking, to watch for subtle shifts in tone, to predict storms before they arrived. Understanding became a way to stay protected, a quiet strategy to avoid conflict, chaos, or rejection. Others grew up in homes where they were praised for being so mature. They were the child who didn't cause trouble, who carried their own weight, who tried not to add to anyone else's burden. They learned early that love often came as appreciation for being low maintenance. And so they kept shrinking themselves to maintain that praise. Some became emotional translators for their parents, decoding tension, smoothing misunderstandings, acting like tiny adults long before their time. When a child is expected to carry emotional weight, they don't complain. They adapt. And those adaptations harden into identity. Even friendships shape this path. A sensitive child often becomes the confidant, the one others trust with secrets, the listener who absorbs everything. Their worth becomes tied to their ability to understand. And slowly, they stop expecting anyone to understand them back. This chapter reflects on those origins, not to assign blame, but to show the quiet way a personality is formed. Understanding becomes familiar. Softness becomes instinct. Self-sacrifice becomes normal. And before they ever grow old enough to question it, they are already fluent in meeting the emotional needs of others at the expense of their own. The psychology of over-understanding. There is a science behind the instinct to understand too quickly. It is not simply kindness. Not merely empathy. It is often a blend of psychological patterns, quiet reflexes shaped by the nervous system, attachment histories, and the brain's tendency to prioritize harmony over honesty. Some people develop what psychologists call hyperattunement, a heightened sensitivity to the emotions of others. Their brains stay subtly alert, constantly scanning facial expressions, tone, and atmosphere. This isn't a conscious decision. It's an automatic response, a leftover adaptation from moments when reading the room felt necessary for emotional safety. Others fall into what is known as the fawn response, a lesser-known stress reaction where the body tries to avoid conflict by pleasing, soothing, or understanding the other person first. Instead of fighting or fleeing, they soften. They agree. They empathize before they express anything else. It feels like compassion, but underneath is a nervous system trying to stay safe. Attachment theory also plays a role. Children who learn that love is conditional, dependent on being easy, pleasant, or selfless, often grow into adults who equate understanding with worthiness. They fear that expressing discomfort will threaten connection, so they choose emotional clarity over emotional honesty. There is also the subtle cognitive habit of emotional over-identification. They don't just notice other people's feelings, they absorb them. Their empathy spills past the boundary of healthy connection, entering a space where the distinction between your emotions and mine becomes blurred. All of this creates a psychological loop. They understand to feel safe, they understand to feel valued, they understand to avoid disappointing others. And because the world benefits from this, no one encourages them to step back. No one teaches them that mutual understanding is supposed to go both ways. This chapter reveals the quiet truth: their overwhelming empathy was not chosen. It was conditioned, a reflex, a shield, a deeply human response that once protected them and now quietly exhausts them. When compassion turns against you, there comes a moment in every overly understanding person's life when their kindness begins to echo back at them, not as warmth, but as a quiet ache. It happens slowly. At first, they brush off the small disappointments. Someone cancels plans at the last minute. Someone raises their voice and later says, "You know, I didn't mean it." Someone forgets to ask how they feel again. And because understanding has become their second skin, they swallow the feeling before it even finishes forming. But over time, something begins to shift. The body keeps score of every moment they minimized their own hurt, every time they made excuses for someone else's behavior, every argument they diffused by sacrificing their own truth. Compassion starts to feel heavy, like an emotional tax that keeps increasing. Inside, a quiet resentment builds, not loud, not explosive, but steady. A soft, internal question begins to whisper, "Why is it always me who bends?" People around them rarely notice. Those who receive endless understanding grow accustomed to it. They learn to rely on the softness, to expect forgiveness. To forget that the calm person in front of them also bleeds. This creates an internal conflict, a tug-of-war between two parts of themselves, the part that wants to stay gentle, and the part that longs to be considered, valued, seen. They begin to feel invisible in relationships where their emotional labor is automatic. They sense an imbalance they can't quite name. And even though they continue to understand others, they feel increasingly misunderstood themselves. This chapter reveals the turning of the tide, the moment compassion stops feeling like a gift and begins to feel like a quiet form of self-betrayal. It is not anger that emerges first, but sadness. A soft sorrow that comes from realizing they have given so much understanding and received so little in return. The moment they finally break the breaking point rarely looks dramatic. It doesn't always come as a shout, or tears, or a sudden collapse. For people who understand too much, the moment of breaking is often quiet, a stillness that feels unfamiliar, a pause where they can no longer force themselves to soften. Sometimes it arrives in the middle of a conversation, when they hear themselves saying, "It's fine," and suddenly realize they don't believe it anymore. The words feel heavy, like something borrowed from an older version of themselves, a version that could no longer carry the weight. Sometimes it happens after a small disappointment, one that should not matter, yet somehow becomes the final thread that snaps. Not because that moment was large, but because everything before it was never acknowledged. The break can also come as emotional numbness. A quiet, unsettling detachment. They no longer feel the urge to soothe. They no longer rush to explain, to interpret, to protect. It's as if their nervous system finally whispers, "Enough." For the first time, they see the imbalance clearly. They notice how many times they excused behavior that left them wounded. They notice how many relationships were built on their effort, their emotional availability, their willingness to hold more than their share. And in that clarity, something shifts. Not outwardly at first, they may still smile, still nod, still speak gently, but internally, the ground has changed. The old pattern no longer feels natural. It feels exhausting. This chapter marks the turning point, the moment the understanding one becomes aware of their own depletion. A moment where they stop stretching themselves thin, not out of anger, but out of an instinctive need to breathe. It is the beginning of an unfamiliar truth: understanding others cannot continue if it means forgetting themselves. Learning to hold yourself healing does not begin with grand decisions. It begins with small recognitions, a subtle awareness of where emotional space has been missing, and a gentle curiosity about what it might feel like to finally give some of that space back to oneself. For someone who has spent a lifetime understanding others, learning to hold themselves feels unfamiliar, almost foreign. Their instinct is still to soothe, to adjust, to empathize outward. But slowly, a new question begins to form: what if my feelings matter too? At first, the answer arrives in whispers. They notice the moments where they feel drained and choose to rest instead of push through. They sense discomfort in a conversation and allow themselves to acknowledge it, even if only silently. They begin to recognize which relationships feel one-sided, and which ones make them feel seen. Boundaries emerge, not as walls, but as quiet lines of self-respect. Not harsh, not defensive, simply human. They start saying things like, "I need a moment," or "that hurt more than I expected," or "I'm not able to hold this for you right now." Soft sentences. Simple truths. Yet powerful in their honesty. This chapter marks the slow return to emotional balance. As they learn to hold themselves, they discover that compassion can exist without self-erasure. That empathy can breathe when it is not forced. That understanding is richer when it flows both ways. Healing is not a reversal. It is not becoming hardened or distant. It is becoming whole, someone who can feel deeply without carrying everything alone. And as this shift takes root, something beautiful happens. They begin to attract relationships where understanding is mutual, where softness is shared, where their emotional presence is met with presence in return. This chapter is about that quiet transformation, a return to themselves, a reclamation of their own emotional space. The freedom to be human in the end. The journey of the understanding one is not about becoming less kind. It is about becoming more whole. There is a quiet freedom that arrives when a person finally realizes they do not have to be endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving, endlessly available just to be loved. They begin to see that understanding is strongest when it is not demanded, when it is not a duty, when it does not cost them pieces of themselves. Life starts to feel different. Not louder. Not harder. Just more honest. They no longer rush to interpret everyone's emotions. They no longer assume responsibility for the moods around them. Instead, they let others be human, imperfect, unpredictable, sometimes difficult, without turning themselves into a shield or a translator. And in granting others their humanity, they reclaim their own. They begin to show up with fuller truth. They speak gently, but clearly. They express what they feel without apologizing for it. They let themselves need, care, hurt, rest. For the first time, their softness is not a sacrifice. It is simply a part of them, a gift, not an obligation. Relationships deepen in this space. Not because they work harder, but because they show up as someone recognizable, not a silent emotional caretaker hidden beneath composure. And slowly, they discover something profound. Being understood feels just as nourishing as understanding others. This chapter closes with a simple truth, a truth they long overlooked. To be human is not to carry everything, not to know everything, not to feel everything for everyone. To be human is to exist with balance, to stand gently in one's own emotions, to let others meet them halfway, and to allow softness to be a shared language, not a solitary burden. Here, in this newfound freedom, they finally learn that understanding is not their task alone. It is a place where two people meet, open, honest, human.